welcome to another episode of my Unhealthy Podcast. And this is the show where I talk to friends and specialists and doctors, and we talk about how to get healthier without going all in. And that is what we're going to do today with my guest. I'm talking with Lisa Franz. She is a nutrition and fitness coach. She's also a podcast host, so she's very comfortable with podcasting. And then she is the founder of Nutrition Coaching and Life, and she helps people achieve a sustainable health without giving up the joy of food in real life. So, Lisa, I like the way that sounds.
Thank you so much for having me on your show, Marv. Honestly, it's a pleasure being here, and I can't wait to talk about all things health, fitness, nutrition, well-being, and just in general, creating a life and a body that you love.
Yeah. So let me ask a question about that line I just read, the joy of food in real life. So it sounds like you're not as restrictive as some people are in terms of the types of food, but I have to imagine that there is some healthiness involved, right?
Absolutely. So yes, my philosophy is definitely food is there to be enjoyed, life is there to be enjoyed, but of course we do have to practice some way, shape, or form of restriction. Nonetheless, my personal background comes from a lot of overly restrictive diets. So for example, I always felt stuck between having to choose either a life that I love, so like traveling, being social, eating out, or having a body that I was proud of and that would perform well. And so I would put myself through diets like low carb diet, paleo, low carb, like, I don't know, crazy fasting strategies and so on. And then I'd binge on the weekend or binge when I was traveling and so on. And of course, mentally, that's not a great place to be. You develop a very unhealthy relationship with food. But on top of that, I did not even achieve or have the body that I wanted to have. And so I constantly felt super limited. And at some point, I vividly remember standing in this food court in Thailand on a vacation, and I started to cry because I thought, I can't eat this, I can't eat that. All these food rules I had placed upon myself forbade me from having rice, forbade me from having something deep fried or something with sugar. And so I went on a quest to find out I just had that intrinsic feeling of like, there has to be a way to actually live life and still be in a body that you love. And so that essentially led me to the concept of calorie balance. And I mean, it might seem really straightforward to people or very common sense, but I basically had to learn that in the end, any kind of diet that we do that allows or helps us achieve weight loss or fat loss comes down to the creation of a calorie deficit. So simply meaning we're eating less than what our body is burning. But most of the time we go about it in a very non-strategic way. So we just cut out carbs completely, or we say, I only have to eat healthy. I can never have a slice of bread or a slice of pizza or so. And so once I learned that really food doesn't have moral value, of course, there are foods we should have more of and foods that are a bit more or less nutritious that we should have less of. I was like, it was like there was a curtain being opened in front of my eyes. And I thought, oh, that's amazing. I can totally fit in that egg fried rice if I want to. I don't need to feel guilty about it. I just need to balance it out with the rest of my day. And so that brings me to the point that you mentioned. Sure, of course, there still has to be a balance. It doesn't mean that I eat Pop-Tarts for breakfast, pizza for lunch, brownie in the afternoon, and then, gorge myself on a hamburger and fries and a milkshake at night. No, of course not. But if I know I want to have that burger and fries for my dinner, I'm simply going to make different choices or lower calorie and higher protein, more nutritious choices earlier in the day. So all that to say, once I discovered that, I was like, I want to teach as many people as I possibly can that they too can achieve a life of like food freedom, as I call it, while learning or educating themselves more about what's actually in their food and how can we get into habits that help us eat in a more nutritious way 80% of the time, but allowing for a bit of playroom the 20% of the time.
Right. So let's kind of take a step back, because that's a huge amount of information in a tiny capsule of how you got here. Let's talk about the fact that you talked about that you were putting these feelings on yourself in terms of how you felt you should look, how you felt you should be perceived by other people. When did you start the journey for health, and what were you doing before then?
Right. Yeah. So I have always been somewhat interested in like physiology, anatomy. So even in high school, I played some sports, etc. So when I finished high school, I kind of knew I wanted to get into the like health fitness sort of space. And at that time, I'm originally from Germany. So I was living in Germany when I was growing up, obviously. And I signed up or tried out for a university, which is the European Sports University. So I knew I wanted to study exercise science. And then what specifically I wanted to do with that, I wasn't quite sure. And I finished my bachelor's degree and then moved to New Zealand. And in New Zealand, I actually wanted to pivot completely because I was like, I don't want to be a personal trainer. Yes, I also got some training on like nutrition and just health promotion in general. But I had no idea what to do with that really. So I actually became a police officer for a few years when I was living in New Zealand.
Okay, that's a bit of a shift.
Yeah. Yeah. Believe it or not, I was just looking for something quote unquote steady, and any police officer or first responder out there will be like, steady? Are you kidding? Like our profession is the opposite of steady. But I just thought as a personal trainer, you have to find your own clients, and you might go through months where you have a big client load and then other months where there's none, and you always have to like fight with that client acquisition. And so I thought, what's a somewhat steady job again, and the police came to mind, and somehow New Zealand police welcomed me with open arms. So that's what I did for a few years, and I learned a lot, certainly about humanity, about myself also. But I realized eventually that number one, the shift work is just really, really demanding physiologically speaking. Like I started having hormonal issues, really disrupted sleep, almost kind of a little bit in mental health problems as well. Like I'm a very positive person, generally speaking, but with, an average 4 hours of sleep or so, I think any person is going to go crazy after a while. So I just realized that my true passion lies more in helping people in a different way. So for example, through health and fitness. And I went back to school and got my master's in exercise science, health promotion, and nutrition. And at that same time, I basically went, or in parallel to that, I went through my own nutrition journey and found that way, and basically decided, okay, I'm going to go all in on that online nutrition coaching, also because it allowed me to work from anywhere in the world. And so I could combine it with my passion of continuing on to travel as opposed to being in one position.
Okay. So it sounds like you went through a lot of ups and downs during that. And I know that the first thought is when you have to be a police officer, you have to be in shape, because you got to do a lot of physical fitness stuff. You got to run. But we all know that as police officers get older, they don't stay in that same shape. So yes. Was that part of what you saw, is that, there was no path to stay fit inside of there and you had to figure it out on your own?
To be honest, throughout my time within the police, I did not notice in myself aesthetic changes in the sense of, or even fitness level wise. I felt like I maintained my level quite nicely. If anything, I probably got fitter throughout the time. Did I get healthier? No, absolutely not. As I was mentioning, like when it comes to just the patterns, also around shift work, like eating around shift work, super difficult for sure.
Right.
And then, as you mentioned, like being in a more not necessarily always negative environment, but overall, poor food quality or 5 cups of coffee in one shift, that kind of thing. Also not necessarily health conducive. But yes, certainly I did also see that many people, of course, mostly due to the stress, they then don't combat the stress with good choices like exercising or seeking out social connections that help them, they combat it or try to combat it with comfort foods, with maybe even alcohol or other things like that. And then is absolutely when we see even more poor health outcomes like increasing obesity and so on.
Right. Now, a part of what you do, you mentioned getting the master's in exercise science. I'm going to safely say you're a little bit younger than I am, and you are still very avid in working out, going to the gym and stuff. Are a lot of the people that you coach, are they younger, or are they still, active in that sense, or are they older like me and, executives and professional careers and not as active?
Right. So yeah, I mean, I'm 36, so I'm not super, super young. I would say
I wasn't asking your age.
I know. I just wanted to let the listeners know in case they're thinking I'm like 22 or something. I have gone through certain things in life, and some people say that from the point that they're 30 or we're 30 onwards, it's becoming harder. And yeah, maybe you can argue for that, or we can talk about that later too. But I would say the majority of my clients are somewhere between like 35 or maybe 30 and up to 60. So okay. I have also worked with people that are in their 80s, but the majority of them maybe between 40 and 50 on average, I would say. So particularly many of the women I work with, they're currently going through the menopause transition, or many men perhaps are noticing like, hey, I'm getting more and more overwhelmed with the duties of my work demands, with family demands, and just in general, maybe noticing a drop in testosterone and therefore also motivation or not building muscle as easily as they once have perhaps. But all in all, you're touching on a really good point, which is we do always have to kind of cater to the phases in life that we're in. I can certainly not coach someone at 55 in the same way that I would perhaps with an 18-year-old, even just because of that fact that I just mentioned, that we have other demands. And so quite often, actually, people come to me and they're like, oh, Lisa, the thing that I did in my 20s that worked so well is not working anymore. Why is it not working anymore? I'm like, well, you have twice the amount of workload at your profession and more pressure. You have 3 kids now. You also have, all these things. And sometimes we just think what used to work should work now. Right. And we fail to give ourselves a little bit more grace for all the things that we have to juggle.
Yeah. You triggered a question in my head, and I don't know if there's a great way to ask this, but the TV, at least here in America, is flooded with tons and tons of these low T commercials for men. Mm-hmm. And it gives us the impression that, hey, just take this supplement and you'll be fine again. I have to imagine, because I know that I don't want any of them suing me or anything, but, in my opinion, I don't think that they work. And I have to imagine that you probably get a lot of men that come to you and say, hey, I'm taking the supplements. Why isn't this working?
Absolutely. And the thing is, even if they were working, the bigger issue for me is that if we're simply taking that and not changing anything else, we're really putting a bandage on a bullet wound. And so what I mean by that is we should always, same thing with this thing, or whether we're talking about Ozempic or things like this, we should always address the habits alongside of any medication if we're choosing to go that route. So right. We still have to address, are we sleeping enough? We still have to address, are you exercising and moving your body? Because it's really one of the very best ways to increase your testosterone is to exercise, to do some sort of resistance training. On top of that, how are we managing our stress? Are we drinking a bunch of alcohol, which just kind of exacerbates the natural drop-off in testosterone? And when it comes to testosterone as well, many people don't even necessarily get it tested, and they simply start taking something because maybe they're feeling low in energy, where it could be many things. It could be, you're not consuming enough vitamin B, or you're not consuming enough iron, or whatever it might be. And at the same time, then also, even if they're getting it tested, we have to understand that the normal ranges are not necessarily what we're aiming for. We are aiming for optimal ranges if we're looking at the grand scheme of things. But what would be even better if we had markers from, let's say, yourself a year ago or 2 years ago, because truly what matters most is how big is the drop in comparison to yourself from when you were 20 or 30 and now you're in your 40s or 50s, so to speak. So there's a lot more to reading labs, or to just like saying, oh, I feel like I have low testosterone, and then acting on it. And in my opinion, if we're choosing to go that route, it should always be under good medical care and guidance, so that we're not just taking some sort of blanket supplement that might or might not do something without even addressing nutrition, sleep, stress management, etc.
Right. So, of course, one of the big caveats that those commercials always say is check with your doctor. And then it's always in conjunction with the healthy diet and exercise regime. So it's always interesting there. Now, when we first started chatting, you talked about the fact that you went through all those restrictive diets. And, you know, of course, we associate diet as a bad word, but and the fact is, whatever we eat, regardless of how we eat it, that's our diet. And the whole thing is it should be a healthy diet. So when people come to you, well, let me rephrase that. So the big kick right now is to, eat clean. You know, we think that if we just find the right foods, that'll do it. So of course, not eating the processed foods and stuff, which is good. But how do you make the jump for people to change from their restrictive diet to clean eating?
Yeah, so I that actually pairs up really nicely with what I was saying earlier, because kind of the last thing I was more or less trying before learning about energy balance was, in fact, the clean eating approach.
Okay.
But I completely gave myself the liberty, I would say, like, if it's clean, so clean, quote unquote, and I can have as much of that as I want. And if it's not clean, then even the smallest thing, like even just a bite of bread or whatever, I'm going to get fat no matter what. So that was stuck in my brain. But for whatever reason, even though I was following this, I did not lose body fat. And then once I learned about the energy piece balance, it was kind of like, again, eye-opening, because I realized, that half a cup of olive oil I've just poured over my salad has like 500 calories in and of itself. Or, the 5 eggs and avocado and nuts and seeds that I'm eating, that's like 1,000-calorie meal right there. So I learned that just because something is healthy or is a whole food, it still doesn't necessarily mean that it's always fitting within my calorie allowance. Likewise, if we're eating some cereal, just like half a cup of a cereal or something like this doesn't mean it's super, super, super high in calories. Is it going to be as filling as a more nutrient-dense meal, like with some Greek yogurt and fruit and all that? Probably not. But in the end, again, it comes down to calories. So what I want to say with this, quite often when I start working with somebody, I get them to start recording their food. We do that in a food tracking app. You can use any app that you like. And just for a month or so, committing to, I'm going to weigh out the foods that I eat at home. When I'm eating out, I'm going to eyeball. And I'm simply going to learn that way what foods are actually high in calories or low in calories. And on top of that, what foods are actually high in protein and which ones aren't. So because meeting your protein needs is one of the best things we can do for our body. And we can talk a little bit more about that later on. But in any case, for me, when I started doing that, again, like I realized, oh, wow, just putting a tablespoon of peanut butter in my mouth as a little snack has just as many calories as making myself a nice yogurt bowl. Or other clients are noticing, they used to think, I hardly eat anything all day. Why am I not losing weight? And it turns out that the creamer in their coffee, the salad dressing that they're using, the little snacks they have here and there, the little bites and licks that they have from their kids' food and so on, adds up to like 2,400 calories. And they think they haven't hardly eaten anything. So I guess to address your question more directly, of course, I want my clients to mostly eat quote unquote clean or whole foods. And the reason for that is, again, we have more micronutrients, we have more vitamins in there, but also they're going to be a lot more filling, which means we're naturally inclined to eat less calories overall than the processed foods. And I mean, that's pretty logical to most people because processed foods by definition are pre-processed. So your body has to do less of the breaking down process, which in and of itself actually requires some calories. On top of that, also, if we look at a tiny little grilled cheese sandwich, which might have 500 calories, it doesn't take up a lot of space in your stomach once you have kind of squashed it down and chewed it down. But if you take 500 calories from, let's say, chicken breast, some baked potato and broccoli, that's going to take up a lot more room in your stomach. So once again, keeping you more satiated. And of course, with the whole food meal that I just mentioned there, we also have more protein in there, which in and of itself is the most satiating macronutrient, and the macronutrient that also requires more calories to be just broken down. So there are many reasons why we should mostly eat whole foods and kind of clean, as you mentioned. But for me, the issue that I have is when people get dogmatic about it, or when we're starting to develop a good and bad sort of moral value type of thing and feeling really guilty when we have anything that's out of that clean eating box, so to speak.
Right. Do you have people that resist tracking? Because a lot of what we have been told in the past is to do that tracking, and some people can get a little frustrated there. So even though it's an app, apps are cool based on what we used to do before with, having to write it down and, physically count out calories and stuff. Are you still finding resistance with people wanting to actually track?
Yeah, sometimes I do. It really depends where someone is starting. So let's say if someone really is mostly eating processed foods, doesn't really have any clue about what in general they should eat, I'm probably not going to start with the tracking approach. I probably will use more of let's just focus on getting more hydration. Let's focus on getting, maybe 5 servings of vegetable and fruit into your daily diet. This is a good protein source, etc. But if someone is eating clean, as we were just talking, for example, and they're still feeling like, why don't I look more athletic? Why am I not seeing any progress? Then it is time to really just say like, hey, give me a month. If after this month, what's a month? What's 5 minutes every day for a month? Let's be honest, we all scroll through absolute nonsense for at least 5 minutes a day. Probably that's a very big underestimation. So, 5 minutes of recording your food should or could be worth it for you when you think about the long-term education that you're gaining from it. And most of the time when I come from that perspective, and people are often that frustrated that they're like, I've tried everything, because that's how I felt as well. I'm like, I feel like I've tried everything, nothing was working. Okay, I'm going to give this a go, even if it's just thing number 102 that's failed, basically. And I think also if you explain it from the long-term value, because for me, really, I don't think that I have succeeded or don't see it as a success if my clients regain weight later on, or if they, just after we're done working together, if they go back to their old habits. I don't feel like I have done my job. And so if I say, hey, with this, you're learning something that you can benefit from in 20 years and 30 years, that you can teach your kids in the sense of, hey, this is a high protein food, or maybe you should have a little bit less of that. And yes, of course, you can have this type of thing. It makes a lot more sense to people. And then they're actually willing to think long term. They're willing to play the long game instead of thinking of, I need to drop 30 pounds in 6 weeks for my beach body, whatever.
Right. So looking back, let me ask this question before I go forward. When did you actually leave the police force, go back and get your master's? How long has it been since you've been doing this absolutely full time?
So it's been over 7 years.
Okay.
I left the police in 2019. And even while I was in the police, once I knew I was going to leave, I started nutrition coaching on the side online, just building up my client base. And then once I had finished with the police completely, I then in parallel to continuing with clients that I already had started or got my master's, basically just to further my education and learn even more. So yeah, I've been full-time coaching for over 7 years, and I love it because truly I get to connect with people all over the globe. I do have the majority of my clients living in the US. There are some in Canada as well, but I also have clients in Europe and Spain, Switzerland, Norway, or the Middle East, like in Dubai or Saudi Arabia and the Philippines. So truly, like every person that I connect with, I feel like I'm learning something new, not just about them, but about the way that they're living, the way that their culture works, because globally speaking, we share different food in such different ways. And I'm sure you can even see that within the US of like, how does someone eat in New York City, perhaps with their families, maybe they're of Jewish origin or whatever. And then maybe if you compare that to someone living in the South, like super in their community and they're very ingrained in their food habits there, even there we can see big differences. And so for me, it's truly a joy and a pleasure and an honor that I get these deeper insights into how people live.
Yeah, definitely different foods throughout our country. So 7 years, I'm going to use that as the marker here. So if you were to go back and look at old Lisa versus what, not necessarily new Lisa, but Lisa now is there something that you were obsessing over back then that when you look at it now, you're like, you know what, that really didn't matter. I shouldn't have been obsessing about that.
Oh, that's a good question. I think in general, at that point, I was very much, I don't want to call it a control freak, but I wanted to control most things just because it gave me a sense of security. I think when you're starting off as an entrepreneur, I don't even think it's a bad thing. I wouldn't change that at that time, but I've certainly learned to loosen up and let go and be more flexible with my times and things as well. So even, for example, with how I was living or how I was treating my clients, at that point, I was very rigid in my methods, and it kind of had to be this way or no way kind of thing. So like you just mentioned tracking. At the beginning, I thought I need to track with everybody because for me, that's like the bee's knees, and it opened my eyes to everything. Now I know I need to meet the client a bit more where they're at, not just a bit more. I need to meet the client where they're at and really adjust my methods according to where they're at, as opposed to pushing my agenda forward, if that makes sense. So I guess the overall lesson would be to let go of control a little bit more and to learn to live with the flow. And you're actually going to have more joy along the way too, because you're met with less resistance.
Okay. So now the second part to that question is, now that you've been doing this full time, you've met with a lot of people, you've seen the things that people have been doing, are doing. What are some of the biggest myths that are happening in nutrition and fitness that you wish would just simply go away?
They usually come back to times of eating. So for example, the belief of, oh, I can't eat after 8 p.m. or I need to intermittently fast, otherwise I'm going to get fat or whatever. And kind of like meal timing, might still be that myth out there of I need to eat at least 5 times per day, or maybe the other myth where it's like, no, you can only eat twice a day. So there is a big variety where the answer to all these things is basically no. The overall matter of whether you're gaining or losing weight comes down to how many calories you're consuming in a day. So you can spread them out however you want. Is there perhaps a more optimal distribution for some people rather than for others? Absolutely. Some people prefer smaller meals, but more frequently, and they can absolutely not do any intermittent fasting. Other people, they're super busy. They don't even have the mind to eat in the morning. There's no problem pushing out your first meal until like 11 o'clock or so, and they'd rather have 2 big meals in a day and then not eat anymore. And that's absolutely fine also because it works for them as long as they are getting in their protein. But so there is no magic meal frequency. There's no magic meal timing. It all comes down to individualism, or like to where the individual is at. And I guess the second biggest myth is still also around carbs. Often we hear, if you want to lose weight, all you need to do is drop carbs or cut out the carbs completely. Nowadays, we even see the extremes with the carnivore diet, with the keto diet, and carbs are the devil and so on. And I will say, carbs are also just a energy source and contain calories, just like fats. Yes, they are processed a little bit differently. And oftentimes people find it easier to cut out carbs because they can still eat out kind of like flexibly. Let's say when you go to a restaurant and you just eat steak and vegetables and you skip the fries that it comes with, that already cuts down on some calories. But likewise, you could also cut down on the fat. So where we're cutting down the calories, if we want to lose weight, it doesn't matter if that comes from carbs or fats. The research is actually really clear on that. And what we can often see is that more active individuals, they do better keeping in the carbs and maybe lowering down the fats, whereas more sedentary people often benefit a bit more from dropping the carbs and keeping the fats in there, just from a blood sugar regulation perspective. But generally speaking, once again, the answer is it really doesn't matter as long as the overall calories are where you want them to be. So whether you want them to be in a calorie deficit, at maintenance, or in the surplus in order to put on muscle, ideally.
All right. A lot of information there. So let me do this. Let me give you a little chance to breathe there, because I know I've asked you questions and you've been going. I want to chat about your podcast, but I usually try to give my guest an opportunity to make this a true conversation. So I don't know if I prepped you for this or not, but do you have any questions for me?
I do, actually. Yeah? I'm super curious what inspired the name Unhealthy Podcast, like how you came up with, or what inspired you?
I had to do something a little bit different because, there's a ton of shows out there all focused on what's healthy. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of people talking about what's healthy, but what I've found is there's a lot of things that we're doing that are unhealthy. And it's not just in our health, but it's in a lot of different areas of life. Our mindset, our stress levels, our stuff. And it's like, what can we do to just get rid of the unhealthy stuff? And that's how cool. I came up. Yeah. So that's how I came up with the name.
I have another question also. I'm curious, what's something that excites you at the moment? Like what brings joy into your life at the moment?
Okay. That's one of those questions that I always say, I don't have an answer for that, because to be honest, so I'm not like most people where, I don't live for the weekend, and I'm done with my days of playing sports, which used to be my outlet. When I got to the point where I was, guarding somebody twice or half my age in basketball, I said, I'm good. I'm good there. So right now, it's not that there's one particular thing. I think it's just when I get through the end of the day and I look back and think, you know what? If it's a good day, I'm happy with that.
That's awesome. It's the feeling of being just content and accomplished, I guess, perhaps. And truthfully, I think that's amazing that you're saying you're not living for the weekends, because I think life is too short to just be living for the weekends or the next vacation. And we should all have, like, even if it's just, enjoying a small cup of coffee in the morning, or getting excited about the birds outside the window, or whatever it might be, just practicing finding more joy in all these little things, I think can create a much more fulfilled life overall than if we think about just those big things of like, it needs to be an amazing vacation, and otherwise my life's not successful.
Well, I think that was part of it. So, I've watched people over the years, and it's always about, their bucket list, or it's about, I have to go travel, I have to do this. And after they do it, then what? Now, I experienced a little bit about that growing up. I played sports, and it was always about the winning, and if you lost, then you knew you had to keep working to get better, to get to the win. And I remember there were times where I'm like, okay, I've won. now what?
Yeah.
And there was a lot of things that happened where I finally just got to the point, I'm like, you know what? I can't just be happy just being
I
here.
love that.
And,
Yeah.
you know, it really culminated in my work with my business. You know, I run my own business, and there's always this push to get bigger and better and to, you know, make millions and do all that. I'm like, well, what's that going to do? You know, is that going to make my, you know, family life better? You know, yeah, it allows us to do more stuff. It allows for some freedom, but I can do freedom with a little less money and a little more planning than
That's exactly it. I think oftentimes, actually, we don't, if we keep chasing that, then we often have less and less time and as you said, like freedom. And so we don't even have the time to spend that money if we're just money focused, for instance, or if we're always like, oh, when I'm retired, I'll do this. When I don't know, whatever, I'll do this and that. Always living in the future, that's definitely not a good approach, in my opinion.
Yeah. And then another thing that I just recently went through with some people, where if we're always looking for something else, then the people that we're dealing with right here and now don't feel like they're, you know, welcomed or that they're important and stuff. So, you know, if you're always looking for the weekend, well, then the people you're spending time with during the week and working, oh, they're not important. Yeah. And I know that people talk about, well, your work life isn't as important as your personal life, and we keep them separated. But the point is, your life is your life. Yeah. You know, this whole thing about work-life balance and all of that, it's your life is your life. Yeah. And we should be able to enjoy every minute of every day as best we can. Now, granted, it's not reasonable to believe that, you know, we can be happy 24/7. But I can be just as happy doing what I do during the week as I am on the weekend.
I love that. I really, really love that.
So
wonderful.
That was an interesting question.
Thank you for answering it.
All right. So I want to make sure I let people know. So we're going to have all of the links to your website in the show notes. We're going to send people to your Instagram,
Thank you.
Which all of these are really much the same. Nutrition, Coaching, and Life is both the website and the Instagram. You do a lot of your posting on Instagram. You also have a podcast called Nutrition and Life Podcast.
That's it.
When you started that, I mean, you are over 300 episodes. You started that, what, in 2022?
Yeah, exactly. October 2022. So coming up 3.5 years. And it's really been a journey. I initially started it more as a client resource because I often kept getting the same questions like, what's a good protein source, or any tips for travel and nutrition, etc. And the other reason why I started it is just for self-development as well, to become a better speaker, since English is not necessarily my native tongue, but also just being able to explain things more on the spot as opposed to researching something and then emailing a client. That's a different story. And the third reason was really for networking purposes. I love connecting with people like yourself or other like researchers in my space, physicians, other coaches, and so on. So it's really been a wonderful journey.
Nice. All right. So as we start to end off the show here, I'm going to ask you one last question, and it's going to be based around the idea of what the listener can take away from the show. So if there was just one small step that somebody listening can take after this episode, what would that step be?
The step would be to reflect on their own life a little bit, in the sense of, where am I really at? So what do I truly want? Because I think it all has to stem from having clarity about your own priorities and goals, and not thinking you need to pursue something just because society is telling you something, or your parents are telling you something, or whatever it is. So once we get clear on, okay, no, actually, I'm quite happy with my habits, or actually, I want to gain muscle. Actually, I'm not as fit as I could be in order to play with my kids and so on, then taking action on that. But I think we first need to develop or have clarity on what it truly is that we want.
All right. Very nice. Well, Lisa, thank you very much for joining me on the show.
My pleasure. Absolutely.
And I kind of mentioned it in my opening. I like the fact that you talk about, helping busy people get healthier, not having to go all in. You mentioned the 80-20, real life rule that you have. So I like that very much. Thank you very much for what you do. And hopefully we'll chat again soon.
Would be my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, folks, if you like the show and you want to check out more about Lisa, again, go to her Instagram or her website and listen to the Nutrition and Life podcast. And if you're ready to stop going all in and start getting sustainable, less healthy, and I read that wrong, reach out and connect with her. And, of course, follow this show in all your favorite podcatchers. For now, that's it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As always, live life, be healthy, and we'll see you soon. Bye.